Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the studio. In this episode, I'm going to be lining and constructing the backs of the frock coat and putting the body of the frock coat together. My name is Kelly Grant. I am sole proprietress, tailor, and dressmaker at Sweet Shoe Historical Clothing, and this video is a continuation on the frock coat videos. So here I have the lining of the frock coat laid out, and just a sneak peek underneath, I have the fashion fabric of the frock coat back, and what I'm going to do is piece the lining together first. And I'm wanting to make sure that both the lining and the fashion piece are the same size. And with this process, it's much like the fronts. I'm going to flat line and hem the bottom skirts, and I'm going to whip stitch the joins. I have a piece down here on the corner, and I have a major piece here. What I'm doing is lining the body with linen and the skirts with what would have been more expensive cotton back then. But I want to keep the back lining of the jacket nice and crisp, so I'm using a good linen. And this is what's going to keep me from sewing my lining to my fashion layer as I'm piecing in those pieces. So I'm going to start down here at the corner and piece this one in, and then I'll piece that in. And I'm using just a whip stitch. My silk thread, waxed, and a fine sewing needle. So I've just slid my little green board in between the two layers, the fashion layer and the lining layer. I've knotted my thread. I'm going to hide the knot in the fold of the fabric, and I'm just going to use a little whip stitch to stitch those two pieces together. If you've taken care to pin the two layers together nicely and flat, you can then pick it up. If you're careful not to move the fabric pieces around too much when you do pick them up. And if this was a curved seam, I would use a lot more pins. But this is two straight seams, seam allowances. It's a straight seam, so I should be okay. So far, so good. And remember to sew right to the end of the seam. As close to the end of the edge that you can get. It's going to make the next steps a lot easier. And then I'm burying my needle and my thread end between the layers of cloth and trimming it off. This seam, I'm moving it around because the folded edges I want on the left because I'm right-handed. And I might stick a couple more straight pins in this one. Just because I'm going to be sewing it up in the air over my hand. And it's okay that I'm using black thread on buff linen. I'm just making sure that my stitches are nice and small and even. When I was doing samples in school, I would often use a contrasting thread to practice making my stitches nice and small and even. And I'm going to sew straight up to the straight pin and then pull the pin out. I'm just giving my seams a quick press. It's always a good idea to press your seams when you're done. And I'm placing the lining back down on the fashion fabric. And with my basting thread, I'm going to diagonally baste the lining to the back, and I'm going to do it far enough away so that I can easily do the seaming. But so that the back and the lining stay together. And that was just enough thread. Now I can fold this up and basically ignore it for the time being. Because like the fronts, these skirts are going to be hemmed. So what I'm going to do now is take some time to fold that edge back so that I'm happy with it. Along the cut edge of the fashion fabric. Give it a quick press. Then I can turn it back and see if I need to trim off any of my seam allowance, because I cut it big. And I don't want a whole lot of seam allowance hanging out inside the coat, because it won't stay crisp forever, the seam allowances, and I don't want them wreaking havoc later on. So we'll trim off that to a nice even 1/2 inch. And pin it to my fashion fabric fairly well so that I can pick it up and work on it in my lap. I'm going to do the 2 straight sides first because they're easy. I need some more light. There we go. That seam allowance is not too bad. Gonna even up a little bit though. There we go. And I'm being very careful not to pull that bias at all. This seam may be a straight seam, but it is on a slight bias, and the bias has stretch. So I'm being very careful not to stretch that bias. I'll also be careful when I'm stitching to not either stretch it or tighten it up any. I want it nice and flat. Okay, and now the curved side, which is going to take a little bit more futzing. And what I'm going to do is pin as I go, and then I will press very carefully. And remember that this is a shaped curved hem, especially in the pleats. So I'm going to be very careful not to cut those shaping off. And I don't have to worry about unpinning and trimming off that seam allowance, because that seam allowance was a little bit smaller than my other ones. I could tell as I was pinning. So now very carefully I'm going to press in between each of my straight pins. I'm going to futz with this corner a little bit because I want to miter it. It's peeking out. And now, starting at a good spot over here, I'm going to fell stitch all the way around with my fine silk thread and my tiny needle. Same as every other fell stitch that I've done before. And once I get this back section hemmed and all nice and beautiful, I will finish the other half of the back, because I'm only working on half at the time, up to this point, and then we will see each other again for the next step. So here are my finished backs, both of them together. And now I'm ready to start putting the body of the coat together. The first seam I'm going to do is this center back seam. And I'm going to just stitch my fashion layer together. So I'm just going to match up the two layers of the wool. And I'm going to pin the top and the bottom, matching up my points. And then pin the middle and pin the middle and pin the middle. And that's so that I'm not sneaking one layer of cloth further down the seam than the other. And I'm going to pin quite a bit, probably every inch and a half, because I know as I sew, the cloth is going to move, and I don't want to move. I want to cut down on the movement as much as possible. The seam that I'm going to use, the stitch type that I'm going to use for this seam is going to be a running stitch with a back stitch every few stitches to secure. And I'm going to pin those linen bits out of the way so that they're not getting in my way. So I'm making a very strange looking sandwich at the moment. And I'm going to start right at the top neck edge, as close to that neck edge as possible. 1/2 inch seam allowance. And you could draw on this with chalk if you wanted to, if you needed to. And at the bottom of the center back seam, there's a notch cut out because the pleats are going to cross over, or the back vent rather is going to cross over like this. So I'm only going to sew down to that notch, not into the pleats at all. And again, waxing my silk thread. Pressing the wax to set it, picking out a good fine needle. Okay, so I've marked in chalk there a little faint chalk line for you guys to have a look at where my stitching line is going to be, because it's black on black and you're never going to see it on this film. You might see the little indentations of my stitches, and that's about it. I'm literally starting at the very, very neck edge, and I'm going to back stitch a couple of stitches before I get started. And then my stitch length is going to be fairly short, but it is wool, so not as short a stitch length if I was going to be using another cloth that's more fine. So I'm going to probably intersperse those back stitches a lot more frequently than I would say if I was sewing silk. And of course, you could totally machine sew this. Anybody who's going to notice this seam being hand stitched is probably looking far too closely at the garment. So there's my seam, and if I pull it open ever so slightly to test the strength of it, it looks pretty good. And I'm sewing right up to the straight pin and then pulling the straight pin out. And that's going to keep my sewing from creeping the fabric along. Hazards of working with silk thread. It's not as strong as other threads are, and it tends to get chewed up by your sewing needle. One of the reasons why you want a short thread length when you sew. So I'm going to do a couple of back stitches there and knot my thread off. And instead of just leaving the thread there, I'm going to run the thread in the layer of cloth. And because this wool is pretty dense, I'm just going to run my thread right in there and make it disappear. So there's my seam so far. I'm going to finish the seam and I'll get back to you in just a second. And down here at the end of the seam, I'm going to do a few back stitches. I don't want that seam to pull apart. And then I'm going to knot off my thread. Oh, and I played some thread chicken here, didn't I, guys? I have just enough. And then again, running that thread inside that piece of fabric. Yeah, look. What, 2 inches of thread? That's some serious thread chicken. Okay. I'm gonna move this back. Now I'm going to press the seam, and I'm trying not to press the linen at the same time because I don't want big creases in that. I'm going to shoot it with some steam, flat like this. Oh, yeah, right. Straight pins. And then what I'm going to do is press the seam allowances open. And I'm using my pressing tool to make sure that I'm just pressing the seam allowance and not the back of the coat. And I'm mostly shooting it with steam. There's very little pressure on the iron. And really the only pressure is at the very tip. So I'm just pressing the seam itself, not the body of the coat, because I don't want these seam allowances showing on the outside of my coat, which would happen if I overpress. Now, what I'm going to do, I have decided which way my vent is going to open. So I've folded my vent the way that I want it to open there, and having that notch clipped makes it easier for everything to lay flat. And now I'm going to lay that fabric over there, give that bit of steam. Just steam, nothing else, no pressure. I didn't do the greatest job lining up that bottom skirt. Oh well. I will figure it out shortly. And because I want that seam to lay right on the seam underneath, I'm giving it a bit of a feel. So that I'm happy with it. I'm not really happy with the bottom of that. I may have to cut a new piece and put it on. So the seam for my lining is going to lay right on top of the seam underneath. And then what I'm going to do is whip stitch that center back seam in place. So I'll just whip stitch this in place, but I'm going to futz with this down here for a bit. See you in a moment. Okay then, since I've got all of this open and I'm futzing with it, I'm going to tuck the top edge of my vent up in underneath that lining, since I can. And that'll save me from having to finish off the inside. So very carefully, not going through any layers at all. I'm just basting that vent lining in place. Get that out of the way a little bit. There we go. I'm going to tack it in place just through the lining to hold it. Now I'm going to run my stitch over. To pick up that bit of lining. Now I'm feeling with that other hand where my fashion fabric is so that I'm not stitching through the fashion fabric. And I'm just stitching the lining to the lining. Now that I've gotten over to the vent, I'm picking up a little bit more of that bottom fabric so that I'm securing the top of the vent a little bit. I'm going to really secure it when I get around to the other side. And remember, folks, it's just thread. If you need to take something apart and redo it until you're happy with it, it's just thread. The world is not going to end because you've ripped out a few stitches. And even, like, this linen fabric is just fabric. It's not the fashion fabric, so it's not costing a fortune, but if I needed to recut this back, it wouldn't have been a horrible thing to have happen. I could have even pieced this lining out of scraps if I wanted to. And on other jackets I have, mostly to make a point. So now I'm going to lay that fabric down flat where I need it to be. I'm going to throw a couple pins in here to make sure that I'm not creeping around on the lining a bit. And again, I'm not going to stitch through to the fashion layer. I'm just stitching the lining to the lining. And I'm using the finger of my non-dominant hand to feel if the needle goes through, which it's not. Okay, in real time, that took me more time to think about it than it did to actually do the work. And here I am back to pinning my center back seam again. Yeah, that looks nice. Top of my vent's completely hidden there. Yeah, kind of glad that mistake happened. Okay, for doing this seam, I am going to switch to white thread because I can. I'm going to wax it the same as I would my silk thread. It's a cotton thread that I'm using. About the same structural integrity as my silk thread. Hiding the knot of my thread in under the seam. Well, trying to anyway. There we go. And using a little whip stitch, I'm going to close up that seam, just sewing the two layers of linen together. Using a nice small stitch. And I'm using a whip stitch. And I can feel underneath that I'm right on the seam. So that makes me happy. Okay, up here I want to be extra special careful that I'm not picking up the wool on the inside, because later on when I put the collar on this coat, I'm going to need the lining to be free at the neck edge. There we go, the center back seam, all nicely done. Now we have to line up that back vent. Super fine. I've lined up that back vent there, and I'm pinning it through all of the layers so I don't have to baste it right now. Back to my black silk thread. And this one, I'm going to double my thread. So I want those two ends to match up. Because what I'm going to do now is stitch along the top edge of the vent. And I just got rid of some extra bits from the cotton lining there. I'm going to come up underneath the vent, hiding my knot. I'm going to do a bar tack at the top of the vent. Attempting to not sew through the knot. So I've taken a couple of stitches and now I'm just going to work over my stitches with my little knots. And the bar tack is so tiny that you literally need a microscope to see it. Okay, so now that I've done my little bar tack, I'm going to come up and I'm stitching through most of the layers. I'm not really going through the lining on the inside, though I can feel the stitches. And I'm just going to make some back stitches across the top of the vent. And I'm feeling on the inside where I need to be. So now there I'm at the seam. I'm going to go down, straight down, flip my work over, and now I'm going to do the same thing on the inside, but not coming through to the front layer. And that's going to hold my other side of my vent in place. And then when I get to the end of the vent, I'm going to work another little bar tack. And cover my bar with little knots. And always, always, always bury the end of your thread in between the layers after you finish knotting off. And there's your vent. And there's the vent on the other side. All right then, we've got a lovely back here. We're going to start to sew the side seams and the shoulder seams together. I'm going to make a little sandwich. This is my front. I'm going to hold the interfacing slightly out of the way. It's going to be a little bit tricky there because it's going to want to be right in the way. I'm going to match up that point where the top of the pleats are, where the relief slash is made. Being very careful not to tear the slash. And then I'm going to match up the top. And these two curves at the side back seam are slightly different. And so you have to do a little bit of finagling there. And that's so that the back, or the side back seam is pulled towards the back, and then your eye doesn't see it when you're looking at the front of the gentleman wearing the coat. So there's my interfacing from the front. There's my seam. That's my lining. I'm going to prep my thread. I'm going to use some black silk thread because I'm going to be sewing the black wool. Waxed and pressed to set. Okay, there I have a knot in my thread, and I'm going to start down here at the bottom, right at that point where I've clipped into the tops of the pleats, and I'm going to make a couple of back stitches right there. And just like that center front, or the center back rather, I'm going to make a couple of running stitches and a back stitch. So it really does work out that I'm making a back stitch every second stitch. And you could do this seam by machine just as easily if you lengthen your stitch length to about a 3mm. That would be about the same length as a hand stitch. And at the end of the seam, I'm going to do a couple more back stitches and knot it off. Hide my thread. This is when a little pressing tool like this is really beneficial, so I'm not having to wrestle with this sheep. I can just press the seam allowance open. Again, just pressing the seam, not pressing the seam allowances at all. Okay, pull that out of the way. Do a bit of sheep wrestling here. All right, now what I want to do is take my canvas and cover that seam allowance. Cover that whole seam. And I'm going to want to clip into the canvas a bit. I think. Maybe. No, I don't have to. Yeah, I do. A little tiny bit. So that things lay flat. Then I'm going to take my lining of my back, trying not to catch anything from the underside, and I'm going to lay that lining flat over the canvas. So I'm making kind of a bit of a sandwich here. And then I'm going to take the front lining and all those pleats want to just stand up at attention, and that's okay. And there's my sandwich, and now I'm going to take the, feeling the seam allowances underneath, I'm going to take that front lining seam allowance and fold it under and pin. All the way down to the top of the pleats there. And that seam is a bit curved, so you're going to have to move the coat around a bit to stay in that curve. So it's going to be an S curve like that. There we go. And now with black silk thread, I'm just going to whip that seam allowance down. You guys get to hear all the studio noises today. Now, when I make this seam, I'm feeling the seam allowances underneath, and my whip stitch is going into the wool on the inside, into that seam allowance, so that it's nailing that lining in place and giving the garment a bit more structure. And each of my body seams are going to be done in this exact same way. So the other side seam and the two shoulder seams, you're going to stitch the wool together, press the seam allowance open, cover the seam allowance with your interfacing, and then the lining is going to be closed up the exact same way for all 4 seams. And then you have the body of a garment. The next video in this series will be creating and setting the sleeves. That's going to be a whole thing all on its own. Easing in sleeves is something that almost everyone has problems with. I see it on homemade garments all of the time. So I'm going to take you through that process in the next video. If you like what you see, please hit the subscribe button. Give me a thumbs up. Leave a comment in my YouTube. That helps me to build more videos for you. And don't forget to hit the notification bell for the next video that goes live. Thanks for joining me, folks. Hope you have a great day.